So, Dr. Gerges here. I'm your professor for evolution. We're using the Zimmer and Emlyn textbook, third edition of Evolution, Making Sense of Life. So there's several really good evolution textbooks out there. I chose this one because of its readability. It covers everything that we need to learn about. But the book presents the topics in a way that are engaging and interesting and kind of story-like. Students in past semesters have said they really enjoyed the book. So I hope you do as well. So I take it upon myself to carefully review the chapters and distill or take out what it is that you need to know and understand. And I try to present that to you through narrated PowerPoint, giving you the terms and the concepts that will help you to understand evolution better. So this is the narrated PowerPoint for the first chapter of the textbook. The chapter's titled The Whale and the Virus. And it's basically an introduction to the whole book. It's telling a story about the evolution of whales and how we understand the evolution of whales, the different questions that we're able to answer, the different ways that we can answer them. And at the end of the chapter, it turns to viruses. And while whales and viruses are very different, in fact, viruses are over 10 billion times smaller than a blue whale. And in terms of genetics, an influenza virus has only 13 protein-coding genes, whereas a human being, Homo sapiens, we have over 20,000 protein-encoding genes. But what ties us all together is evolution. There are common evolutionary processes that have shaped whales and viruses. And so we're going to use this chapter as a way to introduce the topic of evolution and get us started. So let's continue. So let's start off by answering the question, why is evolution so important? I mean, why are we spending an entire semester on this one topic in biology before you're allowed to graduate? Well, it can be said that evolution is the unifying principle of biology. Without evolution, we wouldn't be able to make sense of all the facts in front of us, all the observations that we make of life. We wouldn't understand why they are that way or how they got that way. Theodosius Dobzhansky. He was a famous evolutionary geneticist in the last century, the 20th century, and he's deceased now. But in 1973, he wrote a paper and presented it at a major scientific conference. And in that paper, among other things that he said, quote, "Seen in the light of evolution, biology is, perhaps, intellectually the most satisfying and inspiring science. Without that light, it becomes a pile of sundry facts, some of them interesting or curious, but making no meaningful picture as a whole." End quote. So, of course, to say that biology is intellectually the most satisfying and inspiring science is subjective. I would probably agree, being a biologist. But undoubtedly, what he's saying about evolution being a light that helps to illuminate, helps us to understand all of these observations, all these facts of life, is undoubtedly true. And so it's through this lens of evolution that we can answer some of the most profound questions of biology. Where do we come from? To an extent, why are we here? How did we get here? These are big questions. And we can ask that question about any type of organism on the planet. Practically speaking, evolution helps us out quite a bit too. So, for example, through that light of evolution, we can help to understand the origins of diseases and how they've evolved. And this can help us to fight disease, to conquer disease. Another example, a practical application, is in agriculture or domesticated animals. All of the varieties of plants and animals that we harvest, eat, etc., are a result of evolution, artificial selection by humans. Even pesticide resistance in insects, we wouldn't be able to understand how and why that happens without evolution. Extinctions are happening today at a very alarming and concerning rate, about 1,000 times higher extinction rate today than what is normal. We can understand this wave of extinction and what it might lead to, what its consequences might be, etc., by looking at past extinctions, by looking at the fossil record. So again, evolution can help us to navigate our way during these complex times of our existence as we make difficult choices about conservation of life on this planet. So there's a starting point. Evolution is pretty important. So let's turn our attention to whales and let's take a look at them through the light of evolution. There's about 80 species of extant, that means living, surviving, not extinct, cetacean species. Cetacea is the scientific name for the whales. Despite whales looking superficially a little bit like fish, sort of shaped the same, hydrodynamic, got fins, whales are very different from fish. And in fact, they show their closest similarity to mammals. So it's been pretty clear for quite some time that whales are mammals. And through that light of evolution, we can understand how whales evolved, how they originated, where they came from. I mean, whales share features with mammals such as females producing milk for their newborns. No other vertebrate animals do that. And there's many, many anatomical similarities between whales and other mammals. Our little tiny bones in our inner ears that help us to hear better. Only mammals have those. Whales have those. We have a four-chambered heart with a muscular diaphragm in our chest. Mammal characteristics. Whales have them. These characteristics suggest that whales share a common ancestor with other mammals. Whales have these characteristics that they share with mammals, other mammals, because they came from a common ancestor. Again, this is an evolutionary perspective that shines light on these facts. So, whales also have lots of distinctive differences, lots of unique adaptations. And those arose, we explain, through that light of evolution, through the process of natural selection. We'll spend time on these concepts, including the concept of homology, which I didn't mention a moment ago, but those similarities between species, like between whales and other mammals, if those similarities come from a common ancestor they shared, those are called homologies. Carryover of some terms, again, like I said, that you may have learned in the past. So where do whales come from? Well, one early clue came from a fossil whale called Durodon. And Durodon is dated at about 40 million years old. How do we know that it was that old? Well, that's an upcoming chapter that we're going to cover. How we date fossils. Now, Durodon shares a unique ear structure, the involucrum, that modern whales have. So we can tell it's a whale. However, the hind limbs, it did have hind limbs, which are homologous to the legs and other mammals, but they were really reduced in size, really tiny. You can see that in the picture of the fossil here on the slide, as well as some of the artist's animations. So natural selection was causing whales, different lineages of whales to evolve over time, and these characteristics developed over time. Now, Durodon specifically still had heterodont teeth with different sizes and shapes, with some cusps and ridges and so on, like carnivorous mammals have. So that's an ancestral condition. That's a condition that this whale Durodon had that was a carryover from its earlier mammal ancestors. So we might see through this lens that we're looking at here on the slide that Durodon is an example of an ancient whale, has a combination of unique whale characteristics, but also characteristics that come from earlier ancestors that modern whales do not have. Okay, so can whales be pushed back farther than 40 million years ago? As a matter of fact, yes. This animal depicted on the left part of the slide, it's obviously an artist's depiction of this animal. It was named Pachycetus. It was discovered in 1979, just serendipitously, by a mammal paleontologist by the name of Dr. Gingrich. And he was in Pakistan looking for early fossils of primates to understand our own evolution. And he came across a fossilized skeleton, or parts of a skeleton, that ended up being described as Pachycetus. Pachycetus basically means whale from Pakistan. And what's remarkable about this creature, it existed about 50 million years ago. It lived near shallow freshwater streams. We can tell that from the environment that the bones were found in, the fossilized geologic, remains of that environment. Now, Pachycetus shares a unique ankle bone called the astragalus with even-toed ungulates. That would be cows, goats, pigs, hippopotamuses, antelope. Those are even-toed ungulates. They have two toes. And all even-toed ungulates have this unique bone called an astragalus that's in the joint of their leg. It's depicted on the slide here. So the fact that Pachycetus had the astragalus bone tells us that Pachycetus was evolved from even-toed ungulates. Now, Pachycetus also had a unique ear structure in the bones of the skull around the ear. And that unique ear of whales is called an involucrum. And it was found that Pachycetus had an involucrum. So that means Pachycetus had a uniquely whale characteristic. Pachycetus was, in a sense, a whale. Didn't look much like a whale, but it's part of the unique lineage that gave rise to whales. So that's why we call it loosely a whale. So it gives us insight. Pachycetus gives us insight into where whales come from. So your textbook talks about a couple other fossil whales that are fascinating in the story. I'm trying to shorten or truncate the story a little bit here. But Rhodocetus, Basilosaurus, I'm not sure, might mention Basilosaurus. There's a lot of different whale fossils that have been discovered. So we have a pretty good picture of whale evolution because of these fossils that are, of course, are remains of ancient whales from long ago. So we also have modern whales. There's, like I mentioned, about 90 species of them. So what is the phylogeny? What does the evolutionary history of whales look like? So let's put it together. It's depicted on the left part of your slide here. So we got a time scale on the top of the slide in millions of years ago. So you can work from left to right, from about 55 million years ago up to the present. And the branching diagram is called a cladogram, or an evolutionary tree. It's a phylogenetic hypothesis. A phylogeny is an evolutionary history of a group of lineages. That's a phylogeny, part of the tree of life. And so here you're looking at a phylogeny or a phylogenetic hypothesis for whales. So take a look at the characteristics there on the cladogram, those changes, those evolutionary changes that occurred in the whale family tree. Those uniquely shared characteristics that are marked on the tree, those are called synapomorphies. Synapomorphies, uniquely shared characteristics. So you can see on the origin of the phylogeny there's the thick bony wall around the middle ear. So that's the involucrum. And we can see on the phylogeny there which animals have that. Then the phylogeny branches, the evolutionary tree branches. We've got large, powerful tail, shorter legs, so more synapomorphies for a smaller part of that phylogeny. And so we can use the phylogeny to look at trends in evolution. We can see the patterns of when characteristics were changing and what characteristics were changing. Now we have DNA, of course, to sequence, and we can look at the DNA nucleotides and incorporate that into the phylogeny. And when we've done that, we can tell that whales are indeed, of course, mammals, and specifically whales are most closely related to hippopotamuses, which are a type of even-toed ungulate. So we get some insights here as to where whales evolved from, when they evolved, and the patterns of evolution and change in the whale phylogeny. Now we might also be curious, where did whales evolve? They're aquatic. Did they evolve in freshwater, saltwater? Where did it happen? Well, I meant to superscript those numbers. Freshwater and seawater have different ratios of oxygen isotopes. Oxygen 16 is a little bit lighter, has 2 fewer neutrons than oxygen 18. So I should have superscripted those numbers. So we can tell if something lived in freshwater or saltwater or seawater by looking at the oxygen isotope ratios in the bones of the animals. Now we can look at modern extant whales, and there are some that are freshwater dolphins, and we can see that the ratio of oxygen 18 to 16 is kind of low. And that's a characteristic of freshwater. So whereas marine cetaceans, the ratio is much greater. So with that information, we can look at the oxygen isotope ratios in fossils and look at the ratios of these oxygen isotopes in the bones and the fossils, and we can infer whether they were freshwater or marine. And when we do that, for Pachycetus and its relatives, we can see that the oxygen isotope ratios fall into the range for fresh water. In fact, Ambulocetus, which is a pretty early whale that still had fairly well-developed legs and limbs and a tail, shows a range of oxygen isotope ratios in their bones. So that suggests to us that they may have lived in brackish water, moving from seawater to freshwater, back and forth. Then later whales in the fossil record have oxygen isotope ratios consistent with being marine, living in the ocean. So there we're using some physics in a paleontological perspective, using fossils to understand what kind of aquatic environment whales evolved in. Just talking about this stuff is exciting to me because, as I said in the beginning, evolution is so integrative. It requires sort of a synthesis of so many fields of biology to understand the big picture of the origins of things and how and why they change. So this is a good example of that. Now we can even understand some whale evolution by looking at embryos, by looking at development. In fact, biologists have been doing this for a couple hundred years, looking at embryos and comparing embryos and coming up with some hypotheses of how animals and other creatures evolved and changed over time by looking at similarities and differences in embryonic development. When we do that with whales, what we can see is that early in embryonic development, whale embryos begin to develop forelimbs. That would be their front flippers. And then around week number 4, they start developing hind limbs. There's hind limb buds that are forming. But then later, around week 7, etc., those hind limb buds begin to go away. So there's changes in gene expression that are controlling this. And of course, biologists can understand this and ascertain this by looking at the genetics of and control of embryonic development. So this helps us give us insights into how whales lost their hind limbs over time. Changes in gene expression and natural selection favoring those changes in gene expression, leading to whales losing their hind limbs. Now, when we look at whales and compare them to other animals, and in particular mammals, we can tell whales have really big brains. They have giant brains. So aside from us humans, whales have the biggest brains in proportion to their body sizes of any animal. So, of course, we're scientists. We want to understand why. Why did whales evolve such huge brains? Excuse me. I'll keep going. Sneezes are natural too. So, this is a question that's been around for quite a while. Why do whales have such big brains? Well, the most popular hypothesis, most favored hypothesis, has to do with their complex social structure. So humans also have very complex social structures with language and communication and expression and so on. And it turns out whales have a lot of that too. They form complex alliances with one another. There's lots of male-male competition in pods of whales. Whales form very long-lasting relationships throughout their lifetimes. And of course, they communicate with complex vocalizations and they can recognize each other's voices. So all of this complexity requires a big brain, and that's another component of their evolution. And our whale story continues. We can track whale diversity through time, looking at the fossil record. And if you look at the upper part of the figure there on the left, you can see that whale diversity really increased dramatically beginning about 20 million years ago in what's called the late Oligocene. Now we want to ask the question, why? Why did whale diversity go up so dramatically at that point in time? Well, also we can see from the fossil record that event coincides with increases in diatom diversity, little unicellular protists that exist as algae in the oceans. And they provide a food source for many other tiny creatures in the ocean. So with increases in diatom diversity, that most likely would have provided a food supply for a wide diversity of marine mammals, marine animals in general, that are preyed upon and eaten by whales. So we can understand and track this increase and decrease in whale diversity by looking at their prey sources over time and seeing and understanding that they are related to each other. So now we're going to turn our story to the virus. And it's a much shorter story, in part because viruses are so much more simple than whales. And, well, viruses don't show a fossil record like whales do, so we have a more difficult time tracing their past evolution. But anyway, Viruses are sort of on the other end of the spectrum of life. In fact, as you probably remember, many biologists wonder whether viruses are even alive because they lack some of the characteristics that the rest of us living things have. So they are very simple, very, very simple little particles that can cause an incredible amount of damage, of course, to an organism. And so taking an influenza virus, a virus that causes flu, for example, or at this point a coronavirus like the SARS virus, they're little more than just RNA, ribonucleic acid, surrounded by a protein coat called a capsid, and then that's surrounded by a membranous envelope. There's little protein spikes that are sticking out called hematogglutinins, and those little protein spikes are what helps to recognize host cells, like the cells in our bodies, so the viruses can get in. But viruses are really, really simple in structure, especially when you compare them to something like a whale. So how do viruses work? How do they infect cells and make more of themselves? Well, of course, it can be pretty complex, but the simple sort of story is influenza viruses enter cells when those hemagglutinin proteins match receptors on the epithelial cells of our respiratory tract, up in there, and the viruses enter the cells and hijack the host cell to replicate, make more of themselves. Now, of course, replicating the RNA of viruses inside of our cells, the replication process leads to mutations, changes in the nucleotide sequence of the RNA. Those mutated sequences get packaged into new viruses, and those mutations, most of them are harmful. So they're going to be dead ends. Those viruses are not going to be successful in replicating and passing on. But some of those mutations may be beneficial, and natural selection would favor them, and those mutations then might become more common in virus populations. So if the host survives and isn't killed, and then our immune system can remember those viral proteins and what they look like, and if a similar virus ever enters us in the future, then our immune system will remember those proteins and attack those new viruses and stop future infections. So that's how, immunity basically works. So remember, a few slides back, we looked at whale phylogeny. And whale phylogeny, we got that phylogeny by using both anatomical data, including from the fossil record, and then also some DNA of living whales to compare to other living mammals. And we could draw lots of conclusions and inferences about whale evolution using that phylogeny, that evolutionary history. Well, here is a phylogeny of one strain of influenza, the H3N7 strain of influenza. So the RNA nucleotides were sequenced, and that information, that data, was used to generate this phylogenetic hypothesis of the H3N7 virus between 2001 and 2007. The changes in color indicate where the virus was moving to new geographic locations. So if you look at the map and you look at the color codes of the lineages and the phylogeny, you can trace and track the spread of the H3N7 influenza around the Earth. The thickness of the lines in the phylogeny indicates how successfully the lineage is spreading. And so which lineages are the most successful evolutionarily. So you can track that as well through the phylogeny. So here, I'm just going to draw the comparison then. As different as whales are from viruses, there are still some common threads of through evolution. the fact that there are nucleic acids that make up the genetic code of all of us, and the fact that these sequences of nucleic acids can mutate and change as we reproduce or viruses replicate. And those changes in sequence, those mutations, can be used to help construct a phylogenetic hypothesis to look at the evolution, the evolutionary history of something like a virus. But we can also look at evolutionary history of whales or other creatures. So again, drawing those connections, drawing those similar patterns across all of life that evolution helps us to understand. So where do new influenza viruses come from? Well, of course, there's an evolutionary answer to this, because we're talking about genetic change through time. That's evolution. And what we've come to understand is that when two or more different kinds of viruses enter into a cell, there can be a reassortment of genes that take place. We can get new viruses being packaged inside of their capsids, their protein coats, and these new viruses have combinations of genes from genetically different viruses. That's called reassortment of genes. And when it comes to the influenza virus H7N9, that's depicted here on the slide, we've come to understand the evolution of that virus, having come from chickens, wild ducks, two sources of chickens actually, and some type of other wild bird. So all of these have contributed to the H7N9 influenza that was able to jump from birds to humans. And that's where most influenza viruses come from, by the way, is some populations of birds. Again, evolution. Now, a few years ago, we would have used the 1918 influenza pandemic as the poster child for virus evolution and its impact on humans. Indeed, that pandemic 100 years ago killed at least 50 million people. Now, since the printing of this book, the third edition of this evolution book, we now have COVID-19 devastating people around the world. COVID-19 is the name of the disease, and the disease is caused by the virus SARS-CoV-2. That's the name of the virus. It's a SARS virus. It's the second variation or genetic version of the SARS virus to have jumped to humans. And so we are in the midst of this pandemic. Now, of course, what we've learned from the past through past pandemics and by looking at virus biology, etc., has helped humanity combat the spread of this coronavirus. And in fact, of course, now we have a few vaccines that are being injected into humans just a year after this pandemic started. That's a pretty amazing testament to our modern technology and understanding of viral biology and evolution. Of course, human behavior has made slowing this COVID pandemic difficult. And of course, the reasons that humans make some of the poor choices they do during a pandemic like this, there may also be some evolutionary explanations for even our behaviors during this pandemic. So there we go. I've done my best to try to summarize the story of whale evolution and to take a little glimpse at virus evolution, using influenza in particular as sort of our poster child. And what we can see is that as genetically and phenotypically different that whales and viruses are, there are still common underlying processes to both that direct and have directed their evolution. And that's why it's so important for you as biology students to better understand evolution, because no matter what you work with, in biology, no matter what kinds of organisms you work with. Evolution has directed all of them to get where they are today. And many questions, important questions that we have to answer in biology, including many of medical application, have their roots in our understanding of evolution. So that's why you're being required to take this class, and I hope that you walk out of this class truly understanding evolution much better. So here I'm just quickly summarizing the many different topics that we're going to survey in this class, basically the different chapters in the book. And I won't read through this whole list, but you can see by taking a look over it that there's quite a breadth of biology topics that we can address in this evolution class. So I hope you enjoy the journey with me.